I recently came across a very good book, um, but also a very short book. I picked it up for a quarter, secondhand. It's called The Rule Book for Arguments, and the author is Anthony Weston. It was published in 1987, and like I said, it's a very good book. Now, the book is kind of a basic introduction to logic, um, and more specifically, argumentative essays, but the first part is just dealing with the logic itself, and the second part is the application. Now, in this book, um, there was something on page 55 and 56 uh, where, um, as kind of an aside, um, Anthony Weston appeals to um, the teleological argument for the existence of God, and then brings up the criticisms of David Hume, and he did that earlier in the book as well. So I just wanted to read this couple paragraphs to you. Weston writes, "Remember, for example, the argument for the existence of a creator, which we discussed in section 12. Houses have creators, the argument goes, and the world is like a house. It too is ordered and beautiful. Thus, the analogy suggests the world must have a creator too." Section 12 quoted David Hume to the effect that the world is not relevantly similar to a house for this analogy to succeed. In part 5 of his dialogues, Hume also suggests a reductio ad absurdum of the analogy. Paraphrasing, it seems that the world, and this is Weston's paraphrase of Hume, it seems clear that the world is not wholly perfect. Now, when houses are not perfect, we know who to blame. The carpenters and masons are not perfect either. If we must reason by analogy, then, it seems to follow from the imperfections of the world that God is not perfect. But you would consider this conclusion absurd, since this absurd result follows from your own analogy. However, the only way to avoid the absurdity is to reject the analogy itself. Therefore, God cannot be known by analogy. And that ends the quotation of Hume, the paraphrastic quotation. Spelled out in reductio form, we have: to prove God cannot be known by analogy, assume God can be known by analogy. From the assumption it follows that God is imperfect because the world is imperfect, but God cannot be imperfect, therefore God cannot be known by analogy. So that ends my quotation of Weston. So he was getting into um, the teleological argument originally to give an example of an argument from analogy to illustrate how that works. And then in the section I just quoted, he was using it to talk about reduction to absurdity. Well, what Hume is saying, though, and by the way, um, Hume is all the rage in philosophy of religion, um, but he's very overrated, at least in my opinion. But that's my 2 cents. You can take that for what it's worth. But the parody of the teleological argument that Hume is using, what we may call the dysteleological argument, is um, I don't think a good argument, and that's what I wanted to respond to. If we must reason by analogy, then, it seems to follow from the imperfections of the world that God is not perfect. Well, that does seem plausible on the surface, but what Hume is really doing, I think, is the old problem of evil argument. And the problem of evil argument is unsound. So, or um, in it's not a valid and sound argument. So um, I don't think we need to worry about this particular argument of Hume. The fact that the world is not perfect on the Christian view is because of human sin. God's perfect creation was to include, and did include, human beings with freedom of will. And with that freedom of will, we can choose to sin, and the inevitable consequences of that are the suffering in the world, the imperfection in the world. Um, so it's not necessarily the case that God would have to be imperfect in order to um, keep imperfections out of the world. So that defeats the parity argument, leaving the original teleological argument for God's existence intact. But we could turn Hume's argument around, have a parity of the parity, to argue for the existence of God based on imperfection in the world. How so? Well, uh, the world is, in some sense, not absolutely perfect in every single way. Um, Children die of cancer. Young women are raped. There's such a thing as ska music. So all these tragedies and imperfections in the world uh, are a reality that we know empirically. We see these tragedies happening every day. So the world is not absolutely perfect. But what is imperfection? Imperfection does not exist on its own. It's like a parasite. There has to be a standard of perfection in order for the imperfect to not live up to the standard of the perfection. So we know about certain acts as being just or unjust because there is absolute justice. There's a standard, an absolute standard of right and wrong. Same for beauty uh, and and other things as well. There's a hierarchy, if you will, where you have some things better, some things less good, but this is judged by a standard of absolute good. So the imperfection in the world is only possible if there is perfection in existence, and this perfection Anselm and Aquinas and others would call God. So uh, the the teleology in the world and the dysteleology both point to the divine. QED. Thank you. Shalom out.